Hey, Kua.
Hey, girl.
We're back.
We back.
We're back. It's been a minute.
It's been a long minute, but we are back. We were just talking, like, when was the last time we recorded?
Definitely early summer, maybe late
early
spring.
summer, yeah.
Was the last
early
time
summer,
we
late
recorded?
spring. So we've been, we've been working.
We've been working. We've been also playing hard and having fun as well, but we've been working.
Absolutely. And so now we're getting back to it.
Yes, and I know a lot of people have asked us about the podcast.
Like,
what are you
where
guys
y'all
doing?
been?
Right, so we're back. We're excited to be back.
Yeah, we're back. And so, we're going to dive on in and have some conversations. But I think for us, taking a little bit of a break and step away was helpful, too, so we can get our own things situated. I know you've been working.
I've been working. And that's the thing, too, right? When you're working, you're also a D&I practitioner, and you're also talking about D&I things.
Right.
You do need to take a break, right?
You do.
Because you live this, you breathe it, you sleep it.
Right.
And so you just need that for your mental health, because there's a lot, and we'll talk about that, a lot of things that have been happening.
Yeah.
But we've been working. You've been working, too.
Girl. Working.
So, do you want to tell us a little bit about Clementine Go Group?
You know what? We could do that.
Yeah.
We could do that. So Kendra and I, we do the podcast.
Yes.
We work in DE&I. We're practitioners, but then we also do some consulting on the side. And I can say at the end of 2019, I started doing some workshops and education, and folks started to say, hey, do you do this for other people? We talked about this post George Floyd's murder. It really blew up, and a lot of people are trying to have these conversations. And so we've been both building our own teams on that end. And so Clementine Gold Group is the name of my consulting firm. And it's been growing. It's been growing. A lot of folks reaching out for education, but now what I'm finding is it's shifting from education and learning to strategy and operationalizing those larger plans. And so working with a lot of different organizations across different industries, some corporate organizations, some banks, doing some community engagement as well. And so that is working on some state and some city contracts and things like that. So it's been going well. But to your point, the balancing act has been interesting, so trying to figure that out. I'm still trying to figure that out.
Right. It is definitely a balancing act for sure. For me, so I have my consulting business.
K Savannah.
Yes,
Consulting.
K Savannah Consulting. And we, same thing here, right? Working on a lot of strategy. I've been working with a lot of non-for-profits, as well as people in the education space, because I work in education.
Right.
So a lot of that conversation about equity within education, what does that look like through curriculum, through just overall cultural competency. And so having those lucrative conversations as well. But like you said, kind of moving from let's just have workshops.
Right.
But those are still needed.
They are.
Because I would say even in the D&I space, this is always changing, right? It is not static. It's always changing. So having these conversations, what does the metrics look like? What, how are we getting to those goals? And so that is just a constant change in space. But I love consulting again, and it's been great. But again, finding that balance is tough.
It's a learning opportunity, I think, too, right? Because you're going into all these different cultures. Oftentimes we're talking about culture on the pod. So like learning from different cultures within organizations and figuring out what those look like and how they differ or compare to other organizations. And so I like the learning experience of consulting and just being dropped into different situations. And it's strategy. So it's figuring things out, problem solving. It's pretty cool.
It is.
It's pretty cool.
It is. And every organization has its own challenges. Even though we live in West New York, I know you have some contracts outside of West New York as well, but it's very different. And we are, even though we are a segregated city, we are also we're a melting pot. Right?
Yeah, that's true.
So I think it's really interesting too. Some organizations that I work with are really honing in on the refugee population. And we know we have a huge influx of refugees coming back into our city, especially the Afghan population. So what does that look like, in terms of integrating them into our communities? Yeah,
and I think the bigger, when we have these bigger conversations with some of these organizations, we're often talking about this, what the business case, right? So what's the business case for diversity, equity, inclusion? Why should we be concerned with this? And it often relates back to we're becoming a plurality nation, which means there's not going to be a single ethnic, racial majority in the United States. And so it's already happening in a lot of different cities. We're seeing new Americans come in from different areas. And when we talk about growth and population growth in Buffalo, this last U.S. Census data really tells a larger story.
Right.
Buffalo's growing in terms of our population, but it's because new Americans are coming and living here. So we can't deny that fact. And so it brings us to talk about more conversations around what's needed in order to create cultures that are inclusive for everyone to succeed and be successful, you know? So.
But yeah, so we've been busy.
Exactly.
We have been busy. So definitely, you know, hit up Kua, hit up myself for any consulting needs, because we're here for that. So.
We here and trying to balance
and working a full-time job.
But that's why, you know, we lean on each other too. So as these opportunities come up, we've been kind of creating this coalition of folks that we can call on when these opportunities come up and build. So it's a learning opportunity. That's how I'm going to look at it, through that lens of growth mindset. So we're also a little bit rusty coming back because it's been a little bit. So kind of getting back into the flow of things on the pod. Let's dive on in.
Let's dive on in. Our hot topic.
For the hot topic. We said we're going to get some different like sound cues and stuff. I feel like we need a hot topic.
We do.
Sound cue.
We'll get there.
Jamil. Okay.
Oh, he's smiling.
He's smiling. Okay. So our hot topic today comes from The Guardian. And the article is titled "U.S. Added to List of Backsliding Democracies for the First Time." And so the subquote under here is, "Visible deterioration in U.S. civil liberties began in at least 2019, says international think tank." And so as we were looking over this, you know, there's a lot of conversations that are happening, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that and just the state of affairs in general, because when we started the podcast, this is last year.
2020, yes.
The years kind of mix.
I know they're blending together.
They blend together. But we started the podcast last year, and there were a lot of things that we felt like we needed to talk about. This year, there's still things to talk about.
Yes.
There's a lot to still talk about, but at the same time, I just feel like we've been trying to find our position and voice in these different spaces, and creating opportunities around dialogue about things that really impact us. And so this article, when we were reading it, was really surprising, right? So the article talks about the U.S. being added to this annual list of backsliding democracies for the first time. The think tank that we mentioned earlier is called the International IDEA, IDEA, and it said that it's pointing to visible deterioration that began in 2019. So globally, more than 1 in 4 people live in a backsliding democracy, a proportion that rises to more than 2 in 3 with the addition of authoritarian or hybrid regimes, according to the Stockholm-based International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. And so for the first time, this data suggests that the U.S. is becoming a backsliding democracy. And what that means is there's indicators of impartial administration, corruption, and predictable enforcement, and that decline in civil liberties and checks on government indicate that there's serious problems with the fundamentals of democracy within the United States. So when you hear that and you read that, it's shocking.
It is very shocking. And like you were saying, back in 2020, when we started this podcast, we talked about a lot of things that were happening, right?
Yeah.
And things are still happening. So you have events such as, you know, our former president, Donald Trump, who's really contesting the elections, right?
Yes.
That was a huge thing that is contributing to this report.
Right.
You also have the insurrection that is contributing to this report as
right.
well.
Right.
And so all these different things indicates that we're backsliding on democracy, but it's also not just us, it's other countries as well.
It is. And so the article kind of goes in and talks about that, but these hybrid governments, in the United States, they're talking about the contesting of credible election results, the efforts to suppress participation in elections, which is something that we often talk about too, right? Like, we had a historic election in terms of how many people came out and voted, I think in 2020. You saw historic, lenses from Georgia, the working that Stacey Abrams led in Georgia to get folks to come out and vote, and really bring that voice. But now you're seeing the opposite of that happen, where people are trying to challenge folks to vote. I know there's been, we talked on the last season around what things were being put in place
for voter suppression.
Yeah. And so that's something that we're continuing to see. So we know, there isn't as much noise around this voter suppression that's happening in the States, and the work, like we said, around getting the vote out, getting people really involved in their civic duty, and we're seeing that decline now happen.
Yeah, and also too, the article talked about, with the pandemic happening as well, that's only exacerbated the problem, and what we're seeing today accelerated and magnified it ultimately to these negative trends. And so it'll just be really interesting to see where we fall on the index moving forward. But, even in conversations I have with people say, are we truly a democratic country? Where are we moving towards? What are our principles? What are our findings? But a lot of this stuff, we're kind of backsliding into some of the laws that previously existed.
Ooh.
So, again, we have to think about when we're looking at a democratic state. So, I was a political science major, right? So my poli-sci is coming up. But when we're looking at a democratic state, right, how was democracy founded? Who was it founded for? Well, I think that is ultimately the question that we have to put in place in order to talk about where are we going.
And I think, and I don't want to get too political. We could, which we
don't.
We don't. But I think it really, to your point, who was it founded for? And we're starting to see a lot more of these conversations come to the forefront in this polarization that's happening. And the article mentions this polarization and how it's a real concern, and it's a developing concern for the country. And I know the last election and things that have happened, even on the local front too, has really pitted people against each other. But the reality is we really need everybody in order to move the democracy forward and move forward in new innovative ways to make sure that we're taking care of the people who are hardest hit by things like pandemic, who are hardest hit by poverty, who are hardest hit by a lot of these different issues. But you're starting to see this divide, and that divide is just becoming a thicker and thicker line.
And I think the pandemic exposed a lot of that too. This has always been happening. It's always been there. But really the pandemic is becoming, a battle of the have and the have-nots.
Yeah.
So,
and the battle was there.
It was there, but
it was there.
Right.
It was there. And so I think, now when we ask that question, like who were things made for, it makes me think about a lot of conversations that we have with these organizations that we work with around things like dominant culture, right? And so when we think about it through a diversity and equity and inclusion lens, we often talk about culture and that really being the laying the groundwork for the work that we do, because ultimately you can have as many people, diversity, as many differences and things in organizations, but if you don't have that groundwork laid where it's a culture that is inclusive and people feel like they belong, people leave and they don't stay. And so in talking about that organizational culture, what does that look like?
Right.
What type of traits are being exposed, or what type of traits are being practiced on a regular basis? So what is dominant culture? What does that look like? And who does that culture help and who does it hurt?
Right.
So these are the conversations we're having. But so the article talks about these other countries that you mentioned earlier, right? Like it talked about this knock-on effect, noting that the violent contesting of the 2020 election without any evidence of fraud has been replicated in different ways in places as diverse as Myanmar, Peru, and Israel.
Right. And they also said the number of backsliding democracies has doubled in the past decade, accounting for the quarter of the world's population. In addition to established democracies such as the U.S., but also the list includes EU members such as Hungary, Poland, and Slovenia.
Yeah.
So again, this is very interesting about the state of democracy and what it really means when it comes to politics within the world and how we also interact with each other. Yeah. Right. You just talked about dominant culture. U.S. We have a huge dominant culture in the U.S. and how we interact with other countries. You can just see it even when we're interacting overseas with just most recently the climate change convention as well. How do we interact with other countries, and what does that mean when it comes to the state of democracy? So it'll be interesting to follow this in the next couple of years with this index, right?
You say interesting, and we keep saying interesting. It's going to be interesting. It's scary, too. It's scary, too.
It is definitely scary, right? Because think about this, though. Many people will come to our country, will come to the U.S. to say, I am coming and seek of a better life and seek of democracy, right? Because they've been silenced in many ways. They've been a part of this authoritarian regime, right? Yeah. This hybrid regime. So it's like they seek asylum to come here and to leave that at home, but we're backsliding
You're dealing
into
with
this culture.
Yeah.
But it is scary.
It is. And I think, you're starting to see in not to get into politics, but you're just starting to see these different divides further and further as well. And oftentimes we talk about these generational differences. We actually have a podcast topic for this season that we want to talk a little bit more about generational differences and things that are happening on that end, because you're seeing these shifts, right? And I don't know if it's just us getting a little bit more seasoned.
I like that
seasoned, a little paprika. Yeah. But you're definitely seeing these other generations coming in that have some really valid points. These younger generations that are coming in, but I don't know if it's being listened to often, right? There's this divide that continues. And I guess being kind of in the middle of some of this stuff has been interesting to watch. And so I think we have a lot of work to do. I think that we need everybody at the table. We often talk about how diversity lends itself to innovation.
Yep.
And so bringing all these people who have different thoughts make things better, right? By questioning things, by adding their specific values and thoughts. But you got to listen. You got to listen to it. Yeah.
So that's one thing we've been talking about,
yes.
right? And there's a few other things as well. And this was why we kind of took a break, because we're like, we need to decompress and kind of just realize.
I'm still trying to decompress. Child.
Yeah. So we know in Kenosha, Wisconsin, last year, Kyle Rittenhouse, 17-year-old killed 2 people during a protest. He crossed state lines with an assault rifle, and he was just recently this week acquitted of all charges. And that reaction that I received when I heard the news, number one, I wasn't surprised, but I also too was upset, right? Because this case really sets precedent for things moving forward in our country. And so this case, there's a lot of things that's come out of it, analyzing this from looking at a perspective of, our laws, our judges, understanding what privilege may or may not look like in our courthouse. And so, this week was hard, right? Especially because concurrently we also have the case with the 3 men who killed Ahmaud Arbery as well. And so, again, we're back into this place of, and it's very reminiscent of the trial last year with Derek Chauvin, who killed George Floyd. Very reminiscent of us on our seats to say, hey, is democracy, going back to democracy, is democracy on the side of those who did the right thing, right? Who are not doing anything, like we talked about earlier, minding your business, right? People who are just common folks on the street minding their business. So, it's very interesting to follow this case as well, because this is definitely going to set precedent for things moving forward.
Yeah, we talked about this too, and I think as leaders in the D&I space and as folks who are creating safe spaces for employees and having conversations with other people around how they have these conversations in their workplace, it's exhausting. And it's tough. And I think I'm in a place, we talk often about, just mental check-ins, like, how are you doing? Where were you at with this? And I can say that I've been struggling because there's a certain numbness that has built in myself. And I'll be vulnerable right now. There's just it's a numbness that I find myself having. And some of it might be just to protect myself from some of those emotions and feelings, because we see this happen so often that you're often in these specific spaces of an emotional place that's not always helpful for what you have going on. So we talked a lot about what, the busyness that we have, working full time, doing this consulting, trying to have a life on top of that. And there's also a guilt there, because I know for me, right, like, you need to be creating these spaces so that people feel safe.
Right.
But when you live it, you breathe it, you work it, it's what you do most of your job and things like that. It gets to a point where it's tough to hold these spaces. It's tough, right. And I find myself saying, you know what, I can't today.
No, that's absolutely true. And I know, last year when everything just came to a head with George Floyd and everything else, I know everyone else, you, friends, have received messages from people that you didn't even talk to for 10 plus years saying, are you okay? How are you doing? You know, I'm so sorry that this has happened. You know, I should have spoke up when this happened 10 years ago. All these different things, right? And those messages got really silent.
Oh, it's
really
been silent.
Quickly,
yeah.
Right? And I always think about when we are in this space, especially with me, you know, being the only person of color in my school, you know, or my position as well, I don't get those check-ins, right? I used to get those check-ins. I don't get those check-ins. How are you doing? Even in the space of DEI, how are you doing? Right? Because this is a very tough, burdensome job. And, you know, if anyone is out there listening who manages people who have, you know, not even just manage people, if you have those relationships with people in your office, definitely make sure that you're checking in on them, because this is not an easy task, especially like you said, if you're living this, this is your job, right? You take a lot of this home, and so it's not just easy, you know, getting up every day, going into work, because you know you have the burden of work and things that's happening, and then the burden of the real world as well. Yeah,
and I don't, you know, I wish I had some encouraging things to say. Sometimes it just is what it is, right? And I think that I'm in a space right now where I realize the toughness and the gravity of the things that are going on. Usually I provide that space for other people, but I am having a tough time with it right now, and I've had to really shield and block myself from some of this just to be able to get up and do this work on a regular basis. And so, you know, the work is creating those spaces. And so I think there's guilt there where I feel like I can't be that all the time, but I also am a human being and I have to take care of myself in order to continue to do this work over a long period of time. So it's a crazy balance to be in this space. I think it's important for practitioners who have to deal with this on a regular basis to hear this. It ain't always gold and glitter and gold, whatever. It's not always that. It is sometimes wrestling with things and recognizing when you might need to take a step back to make sure that you're doing well, because they say you can't pour from an empty cup.
Right.
You know, they always talk about the oxygen, secure your oxygen first. And I think I'm kind of in a space like that as it relates to this latest news. I don't have it to do.
No, I don't. I definitely agree with you. And I think this is why allyship is so important.
Yeah.
Right? Because a lot of times we are the people who are always trying to push forth the agenda or making sure that everyone understands things from an equity lens, right? You are that person constantly educating. But I feel like after a while, you start to educate one, that person starts to educate two, and so forth and so on, right? So this is where allyship just comes into play, where it says, you know what, I got this, or I got you, or whatever the case may be. We talk about all these things, but what does it look like in real life, right? So I think that's really important. I think also creating that space, like you said, for yourself is really important as well. Leaning on people who are just like, you know what, we're not going to talk about anything that's going on in the world today.
Right.
Guess what? I'm going to talk to you about what happened on Shade Room today.
Right.
So like I saw this on Instagram, or whatever the case may be, because it just relaxes your mind, right? So definitely, you know, DEI practitioners have to find an outlet. Yeah. It's mandatory because you will burn yourself out quickly.
Really quick. And so we often we'll talk about, we reiterate self-care and exercise and all these different things that you need to do. I was talking to a local practitioner recently, and she was in a space where she really needed to vent, and I held space for her to do that. But you're hearing this, right? So we went from last year, this being, to your point, oh my gosh, everybody, right? We were at a pause with the pandemic. We saw what happened with George Floyd. Everybody was like, what can we do? And now fast forward a year and change later, and we see the conversation has shifted, right? And so where there was a lot of support and people putting energy behind it before, we're now in a space where, you know, it's not the same, right? And so I think that has always been our question. Is this work going to be around for a long time? I think so, because we see these shifts happening from a demographic standpoint, but is there going to be the support? Is there going to be the value of the work that's there over a long period of time? And I think we still have yet to see what that looks like, you know?
Exactly. So, you know, we talked about, you know, mental health, taking care of yourself, you leaving space for that as well. And I recently had a conversation with someone that I thought was really interesting, because we talked about, what do you do for your mental health? Yeah, you can take bubble baths. Yeah, you can go get facials. Yeah, you can turn off your phone. But mental health now kind of looks a little bit different, right? Mental health looks like managing relationships, right? We always talk about the iceberg, right? What you can see. Those are the easy things about the quick hitters, the bubble bath, the relaxation. But underneath the surface is managing those relationships, managing expectations, all these different things. And that is the mental health that I'm trying to focus on. It does take work, but at the end of the day, you will be so much happier when you do start to manage those things as well. Yeah. So I thought it was really interesting, the conversation I had with her about that. She knows who she is if she's listening. Right. That was a good conversation.
Yeah, and I think we have to be realistic about the ins and out of this work, the good and the bad, right? Because I think there's been a lot of shine on D&I and a lot of people trying to get into the space. But you also have to recognize that there's realness that comes with this work too, especially when you have the lived experience as a Black woman, as a person of color, as a woman, and you also have to kind of provide these spaces for other people. So as much as it's great and you're creating these spaces for other people, you have to recognize that you have to attend to your needs and that self-care. And so, I don't think I was planning to go this heavy with it.
No, but it's true. But it's real. It's a space that you definitely need in. And I think, some of these things will be sprinkled in. Yeah. As we get through the season 3 as well. At first of the season we were super excited. Yeah. We have so much to share. Second season was just like an update, things that's going on. But I think the third season you're really going to start to see like just having raw conversations about the space that we're in, from moving from 2020 to 2021, and what does that look like?
And going into 2022.
2022,
it's November.
Which is crazy to even say.
We going into 2022. It's also Native American Heritage Month this month. We're getting ready for Thanksgiving with our families this week and kind of holding space. I'm looking forward to that. I really am. Yep. And it's a great way just to disconnect and allow yourself to be full of love surrounding your family or friends. Some people do the Friendsgiving and things like that. So. Yep.
Woo. So yes, heavy. But our season's going to be great, though. We have so many amazing topics
and guests. Yeah.
So stay tuned for our guests. But we're really tuning into our LGBTQ plus community within Western New York and beyond. Really, again, talking about our dominant culture as we discussed a little bit today. Moving into conversations about health equity, mental health, community. Yeah. Building community. Yeah. What does that look like? And then again, generational just differences and what does that look like as well as we start to communicate with each other and work with each other in different spaces. So I'm definitely very excited. Again, if you guys have any questions or if you guys have any comments or topics or people, definitely hit us up. I apologize for my voice today because
she was partying, y'all. She wasn't partying, but she I don't know.
I've been doing a lot of talking.
You have been doing a lot of talking.
And I've been talking at work. I've been talking with consulting. I've been doing so many different things. So I'm trying to rest my voice as much as possible. Okay. But I was super excited to come back on the pod today. Yeah. Could not hold our excitement, so I had to be here. So I apologize for my voice. But so definitely hit us up, communicate with us. And we're super excited to bring you season 3.
We're coming back, y'all. It's been a minute. We've had a few different folks reach out. We had some plans for how we wanted to start the season, but you know what? I think creating that space for us was really important. Yes. And so we're back at it, some new energy. I think just bringing some raw conversations to the table and talking about the realness of this work is important. Yeah. So.
All right. Well, that is episode 1.
Episode 1 in the books.
Of the Black Gems Diving podcast. Right. So thank you, Kua. And always a shout out to Jamil Cruz, who is our producer behind the scenes with his lovely studio. Thank you, Jay Cruz, for that.
See y'all next week, y'all.